In this session, I am going to talk to you about another major Indian English poet. It is Keki Daruwalla. As I was indicating to you in an earlier occasion, Indian English poetry has a very long tradition. The first major Indian English poet is Henry Vivian Desrosiers, and even at that time in the 19th century, we had a woman writing called Toru Dutt. So Indian English poetry has had a woman writer at the beginning of its tradition, which I think is a wonderful thing, because we often think that women have been sidelined, but at least in the Indian English tradition, it looks as if women had a time and a space to express themselves. But I am more interested in quickly developing for you a context for Keki, so that you can see him in the context of Indian English poetic tradition. And I am quickly zooming the camera, so to speak, into the 20th century and around the time of the 1940s and 1950s. This is the time when three major Indian English poets come onto the scene. One of them is, of course, Nissim Ezekiel. The other is A.K. Ramanujan. And the third is R. Parthasarathi. Now, these three poets are called the triumvirate of Indian modernist verse. And all three of them are in a way to be seen as rejecting the somewhat grandiloquent, metaphysical, obscure and sentimental poetic tradition which until then had been handed down to them. But that is the first big generation of modernism. And then comes, the 50s and the 60s go on. And in 1970, Keki Daruwalla publishes his very first volume of poetry called Under Orion. This is in 1970. And from then till today, which means that he's about 40 years into the business of writing poetry, he's indefatigable, he continues to write. He's recently published a novel, and he's still very, very active in the poetic scene. He's about 75 years old now. He won the Sahitya Academy Prize for his poetry in 1984. And then he followed it up with the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, which is a very prestigious prize in literature, in 1987. Now, it is not as though Keki Daruwalla is like Tagore. When you think of Tagore, you think of a poet, the image of the poet, flowing beard, maybe a fez cap, a gabardine, and every inch of the way you think that this is a poet walking and talking to you. But Daruwalla has some other features. He was a cop, he was a policeman. He was with the research and analysis wing. So he's very uncomfortable when you talk to him about his police days. But the fact is that he was in the police, and he has seen action in some of the most difficult situations where riots broke out in some parts of the country, and he was heading the battalion which had to keep the rioters at bay. That's the kind of experience he's had. So he's unsentimental. You're not likely to find him, syrupy in his sentiments because of the cop in him. I'm not suggesting that because you're a cop, you can't have any sentiments. But you are a cop who has gone through some very difficult moments in your career where you've had to face crowds and tense situations. There's no room for sentimentality there. You've got to be very clear-cut, clear-headed. You've got to have a certain toughness of spirit. I think something of the toughness of spirit is available in his poetry. Though I would not want to make a one-to-one correspondence between the profession of being a policeman and the toughness of the poetry. It's not as though it is a direct connection, but there must be some connection between one's life and one's poetry. Now, many people have pointed to the latent violence in his poetry. And many people take the easy way of saying, well, as a policeman, he must have indulged in a lot of violence. Therefore, violence comes naturally for him in his poems. I think that would be a very incorrect way of looking at the poetry. Because what is the violence doing in his verse? The manner in which Ted Hughes talks of the crow and of the falcon and about, otters and other kinds of, animals like the thought fox, that famous poem of his, recalls something of Keki Daruwalla's spirit of violence, but violence which is meant to cleanse, which is meant to open up the wounds, violence which is meant to heal, in a sense, the psychic wounds of man. So I think that's the kind of poetry Daruwalla is capable of. While he is a Parsi, presumably, but having seen service in different parts of the country, has been able to see life in universal terms. For him, the geographical space called India is a limiting factor. It is, of course, important for you to have roots in wherever you are in your country, like Kamala Das having roots. But then for Keki Daruwalla, the whole world is his universe. And when you read his poetry, you come across a poet who, apart from being raw and tough, is also learned. Because you can find him writing poems on paintings, poems on architecture, poems on philosophers, the kind of learned university wit kind of poetry which we associate with some poets in England and America of the 1950s and 60s. You have Keki Daruwalla doing that kind of thing. Then we have the capacity to move from one cultural landscape to another cultural landscape. To give you an example, he is capable of taking you back to ancient Kalinga. Kalinga is Orissa, but Kalinga is the place where Ashoka fought that terrible war and found so much suffering, so much cruelty, which he himself had perpetrated, that one fine day he decided to leave all this behind and embrace a non-violent creed called Buddhism. Okay? So that capacity of Keki Daruwalla to take you back to the old world of Kalinga. He can move from Kalinga to Varanasi, the most holy spot for Hindus, Banaras or Kashi as we call it, where he talks about Banaras in all its manifestations. One of the things about Banaras is that it is about leaving the body, all right? And you know that funeral pyres are there all over the place. The Ganges is very often the receptacle of dead bodies too. People, immerse the bodies of children in the rivers. And when they cremate, part of the body is even pushed into the river. So it becomes a very polluted river in some ways. But it's about leaving the body. But strangely, Banaras is also a place for akhadas and wrestling. And it's one of the great centers of wrestling. So the body is given importance in Banaras also. So this irony which you find, the contradictions in life, and life is full of these contradictions. None of us is consistent 100%. We may say one thing today, but we'll do something else tomorrow. In the same day, we may contradict ourselves. All right? So the contradiction in life is, I think, brought out beautifully in Crossing the Rivers. It's a wonderful volume of poetry by Daruwalla. I'm mentioning a few of his, themes. He can move from Varanasi to latter-day Bombay. After all, Bombay is the bustling metropolis, the commercial center of India, and it's a wonderful pluralistic city, but a pluralism which is in danger of being destroyed by some local elements who believe that outsiders should be sent away. North Indians particularly should go back to wherever they came from. That kind of fanaticism, the sons of the soil theory, is threatening to destroy Bombay. And Bombay, with all its contradictions, its agonies and ecstasies, is Keki Daruwalla's territory. So you'll find him writing about Bombay as well. He can go as far as Mallorca in Spain and talk about a soothsayer in Mallorca, and then he can move from there to talking about the Buddha or a Buddhist philosopher. So he has a whole range of subjects. And when you read Keki Daruwalla, you feel that you are suddenly into a world of learning, of of expansive cultural horizons. And in his world, there's no room for pettiness, narrowness, domestic insularity, xenophobic hatred, and so on. I think it's a very liberating kind of poetry. So today I have chosen one poem of his which is good. It's a good representative of the kind of things which he can do. Not all the themes I talked about will be available there, but you will find here imagistic brilliance. And that is what I want you to concentrate on, because one of the things about Daruwalla's poetry is his capacity for strong images, and also the capacity to move from one idea to the other in a logical way. He never gives up narrative in his poetry. So there is always the soothing sense of a syntax holding together the various images together, and the images themselves are subsumed under an overarching power of syntactical jointing. Okay? This is one of the things which you should keep in mind. So here is Keki Daruwalla telling you, look, I have come to the seashore and I saw a fish which is on the seashore. Obviously it's dead now. It's been either fished out or it's come on shore for some reason and it's not been able to go back. And he's describing for us the experience of seeing a fish on the seashore. Keki Daruwalla, being a Parsi, is very anglicized. Okay? He is not like some of the other poets who come from other parts of the country, who have a much stronger mother tongue pull, which allows them entry into the English language only with a little bit of difficulty. Take Jayanta Mahapatra, for example. When you read Jayanta Mahapatra, you feel that you're reading an Oriya poet. He's an Oriya poet in English. There's no question about it. When you read Hoshang Merchant, my good friend who lives in Hyderabad, or Keki Daruwalla, you know that these people are Parsis, but they are so westernized. They have a command of the English language which is an envy for us. And therefore, you don't feel as though this is an Indian writing in English. It's like an English poet, perhaps, writing in English. Not that English poets are anyway, superior or anything. I'm not saying that. It's just that there is a facility with the language which other poets have to struggle to get. While in these cases, it seems to be so natural for them. So that's why the sea came in with her and her curved snout. The sea brought her and her curved snout. The sea came in with her and her scimitar snout. The sea brought her in. The sea fell back. And you see the number of action words there. Verbal energy. Verbal in the sense of verbs, action words. Verbal in the sense of words. So verbal energy of the poem is something I want you to keep in mind. Then if you just look at the word curved, okay, curved snout. And the snout, that is the nose of the fish, is also curved like a scimitar. So you see how in a very deliberate way Keki Daruwalla is able to use a word here and then echo the same word in another part of the poem. When somebody does that, it means that he is in complete control over the poem, isn't it? That he knows exactly what he has to say, what word he must use. Not a single word there is adventitious or by accident. It is there deliberately placed. Can we have one more example of this kind of thing, this echo going on? Can I ask you whether the word threaded in the third line of the first stanza, the long threaded rose moles, is echoed in a word elsewhere?
Filigree.
Filigree. Oh, very good. That is in the fourth stanza, which says, and the filigree of her rose moles. And in fact, the rose moles comes again. There's a repetition of the same phrase. So immediately we realize that threaded and filigree have something in common. What is filigree? Filigree basically means using a thread and weaving beads and so on together into a pattern. Filigree artwork. Okay, it's a good kind of tradition in art, and it looks as if the fish looks like a filigreed artwork, right? with everything beaded, everything put together, and a thin silver line, silver thread holding it together. Because the fish is silvery in color, fish is silver in color, tin and silver. The word tin reminds you of silver, right? Okay. So, these 2 or 3, instances of repetition, recurrence of patterns, you find that Keki Daruwalla has written a poem which is fully crafted. So it's not spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Even if it is beautifully, controlled. It's emotion recollected in tranquility, and form and art matter, isn't it? Because finally, what is literature? Literature is literature because it's not life. Art is art because it's not life. It may come from life, but it is something which enhances life. We have a silvery world, but the world of poetry is golden. From brazen to golden, from brass to gold. We transmute it in art. And I think the way it is done is through a deliberate structuring of the poem. And I think what is happening here is a wonderful experience of seeing a fish. And what is the size of the fish? We are told about it. All 5 feet of her, he says. In stanza 4, he says all 5 feet of her. And then remember that the word armor again sets you thinking. He talks of the armor of her scales, of the scales on the body are like armor. Molds are like scales. The tin, the barnacles are like scales. And all of that looks like armor which is worn by a soldier. Okay? So the fish looks like a soldier with armor. Right? So many suggestions and meanings come out. And there's no great metaphysical significance here. It is just a piece of description of a fish which has been somehow brought onto shore, either through human agency or through natural agency. Sometimes fish, die and they get washed onto the shore. And you find a whale, for example, breathing heavily, and then some people pick it up and then throw it back into the sea. We have heard about all these things. So this is just a scene of a fish 5 feet long, scaled, barnacled, snouted, scimitar-like, armored, which is lying there, yeah, which has a rose mole and so on. Okay, so let's read the poem again once, and then we can conclude. The sea came in with her, and her curved snout, and her tin-coloured barnacles, and long threaded rose moles patterned on her body. So the body is patterned with rose moles, long threaded rose moles, filigreed, so to speak. It has barnacles, which are, of course, kind of a bit of the mouth. The horse has a bit. It's a thing which is kept into the mouth. The cow also has it. And the fish seems to be having it, though it's not really having a bit, but it looks like a barnacle. Okay? Tin-coloured. Look at the expression. The visual imagery is very important here. And imagery can come in various forms. It can be about smell, it can be about touch, it can be about hearing, it can be about seeing. Seeing is what is happening here. We get to see the fish itself. The sea brought her, and her curved snout, and her rose moles, and her eyes still translucent. What is translucent? It is that which is not, it's not exactly transparent. Transparent means you can see through completely, and the light goes clearly inside it. Translucent is where the light gets dispersed, diffused. It is semi-transparent. Okay, so the eyes of the fish look glazed and semi-transparent when it is dead. Okay? Yeah?
Like water.
Like water, exactly. As if half aware and half unaware of the state of her body. So there's also consciousness in the fish, or the poet is able to tell you something about what kind of thinking the fish seems to be having, unaware of itself, half aware of itself. Of course, it's dead. As far as I can see, it's a dead fish. The sea came in with her, and her scimitar snout and her translucent eyes graying into stone. Look at that brilliant image. See, when a person dies, initially it looks lively. It looks as if there is life. And slowly, over a period of time, that's why when the first thing people do is to close the eyelids. But if you don't close the eyelids, the eyes begin to solidify and looks like a piece of stone. And it's exactly what happens to the fish. Nobody goes and closes the eyes there. All right? Okay. The sea came in, and her scimitar snout and her translucent eyes graying into stone. Graying because it becomes grey in color, into stone. Right. The sea brought her in, wrapped in seaweed. That's another thing. When the sea pushes the object onto the shore, it go along with a lot of filth and other things also. It's not as though the fish will come clean. All right. Wrapped in seaweed and slapped her on the sand. It just fell on the sand, as though it was a slap to the sand. All 5 feet of her, with the armor of her scales and the filigree of her rose molds. The repetition, again and again he's saying the same things. The tide kept coming in. Tide comes in and goes out. High tide, low tide, they say. The tide kept in, but couldn't disturb her. The fish was lying on the sand. It could not be disturbed, could not be moved, or her resting place. She was heavy. And when she's heavy, it means she's dead, because the dead body becomes heavier and heavier and heavier. The sea fell back. But even as the thin-edged foam line receded, it went to her once more with a supreme effort, rummaged among her barnacles, and left. The sea, as you said, it's a relationship between the sea and the fish. Initially, the fish was in the sea. The sea decides to get rid of it, so to speak, throws it into the sand, slaps it onto the sand, and then tries to reach it again and again, is not able to shake it. And finally, the sea fell back as though defeated by the endeavor. But even as the thin-edged foam line receded, look at that beautiful image. Look at the power of observation of the poet, the very close and specific, minute observation Keki Daruwalla is capable of. Okay? And as the thin-edged foam line receded, it went to her once more with a supreme effort, trying hard to shake her, rummaged among her barnacles. Rummage means just went searching to see if you could shake this thing, but failed, and left. The sea left.
Sir, in the term rose molds, does the poet refers to the smoothness of the flower, to the smoothness of the skin of the fish?
The smoothness of the flower, you mean?
Yeah. The rose is very smooth.
Yeah, but you see, the mole is not smooth. It's a rough patch on the body. So I suspect that, when you see a rose from a distance, it is fluffy. And the mole on the body all looks like a rose in terms of its fluffiness. That's how I was reading it. It could also be not a dark mole, but slightly reddish in color. It could be like the color of the rose. I don't know about the smoothness of the rose, but that's another possibility. It adds a possibility to it, I don't know. But this is exactly the point, that there's no end to the number of meanings which we can read. And good reading is very important, and that's how you begin to sensitize yourself to language. Many people think that literature is a very poor medium for teaching language. My own feeling is that if you want to teach good language skills, take them to a poem like this. You can see so many things have happened here. So much, it's opened up your mind, and you begin to see the English language in a different way. You begin to get excited about the use of the language. And who knows, this evening you may go and write a poem yourself, inspired by Keki Daruwalla. Simply look at the poem as a poem which gives you a visual impact of an experience. I think it's a classic example of what we might call an imagist poem in Indian writing in English.
So we have emphasized so much on the visual imagery of the poem. So is it comparable in sorts to works of, say, people like William Carlos Williams in the very sensitizing of it?
I think the poem which naturally comes to mind is The Red Wheelbarrow.
Yes, sir.
Some of you must have read that, where he says, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow amongst the rain, glazed in the rain, and the chicken around and so on. And many people immediately began thinking of it as a great story of American agrarian culture, about the decline of American agriculture and the need for wheelbarrows. I mean, they went on, giving all kinds of funny interpretations. This is what I meant by stock response. The desire to see more meaning in a poem than the poem is willing to give you. And so much depends on a wheelbarrow. That's it. It's an object, it's an image. And as you know, you can't do any agrarian operations without a wheelbarrow to remove the stuff and store it somewhere. So you're right. I think at that level, it's a kind of objective poem. It's a poem called, Williams called himself an objectivist. I think it's an objectivist poem. And coming as it does in 1970 or 75 when he wrote this poem, and Carlos Williams was in the 1930s or 40s, you can see that poetry continues to have a continuity. That people write poetry, and the desire to write poetry is universal. The material of art is never usually the same, but art itself never changes. And that is T.S. Eliot's great remark. And I shall conclude by quoting that remark. Art never changes, but the material of art is never quite the same. Okay? Thank you very, very much.